Very good. Okay, good evening everyone, and welcome to Christianity A&E Answers and Evidence. This is the first of 6 weeks where we're going to be looking at the evidence for Christianity, asking, is there any evidence? And we're going to see what we find. So, tonight we're going to be looking at the God deduction. So we're going to be looking tonight, seeing, is there any scientific evidence for God? In 1 Peter we're told, but in your hearts revere Christ as Lord, always be prepared to give an answer to anyone who asks you, to give a reason for the hope you have, but do this with gentleness and respect. So I've got a question for everyone. Why do you believe what you believe? If we were to ask the average Christian why they're a Christian, what answers do you think we would get? Anyone got any ideas? Yeah? Yeah. Yeah. Of course. I mean, for a lot of people, it is everyone has an individual story. Everyone, it's not a simple, I fit in this box, I fit in this box. But when surveyed, most Christians gave the following answers. Number one, by far, was they were raised in the faith. That was the number one answer for why a Christian was a Christian. Number two, they found the idea attractive after talking to a friend. And number three, some personal experience convinced them that it was true. Now, this might apply for some of us here. For me, I was raised in the faith. That is how I first came into contact with Christianity. But then I became an atheist. So it is not the reason I'm a Christian today. None of these answers mean that Christianity is false. They are all perfectly valid answers. But what my question is, what do you think people from other faiths would give as a reason to why they believe what they believe? Do you think they would be different than the answers which we saw most Christians give? Or would they be the same? Do you think they'd be different? Or so if you said to Muslim or Hindu or Sikh or Buddhist, why are you of that religion? Do you think most of them would say they were raised in the faith or they found it attractive? Or would they give a different answer, do you think? Yeah. Oh, so why they believe in their faith. Yeah. Yeah. See, for me, I thought, in my personal experience, that the answers might be quite similar. But if you were to say to an atheist, why do you believe what you believe? Do you think an atheist is going to say, I was raised in an atheist home? Do you think they're going to say, I found the idea of atheism attractive? Or I had a personal experience which made atheism true? Or are they more likely to say, well, I think the evidence points that way? See, when I lost my faith, I started doubting when I was in high school, lost my faith when I was at uni. And when I was at uni, if I spoke to a Christian, it would be, why do you believe the Bible is true? Say, because Jesus says it's true. Well, how do you know Jesus is who he says he is? Because the Bible says he is. Well, how do you know the Bible's true? Because Jesus says it's true. Well, how do you know Jesus is true? Because the Bible says it's circular logic. Whereas the atheist would say, well, evolution shows this, the Big Bang shows that God doesn't exist. They gave actual reasons, which is ironic because, like I say, I became an atheist because of the reasons. But now, because of the scientific and archaeological evidence, I'm stood here presenting the first of 6 weeks of evidence for Christianity. So, have you ever heard the term science versus religion? Now, what's implied there? There's an implication that these two things are not compatible, that they're at odds with each other. I mean, is that true? Dr. Gary Cohen thought so. He said, science and faith are fundamentally incompatible. Science helps religion only by disproving its claims. Now, there are quite a lot of scientists who still believe that. A lot of people believe that. However, Albert Einstein said, science without religion is lame, and religion without science is blind. They need to work together. So we need to mind the God of the gaps. This is something which Christians are often accused of when they talk about science. If there's something which a Christian doesn't know, insert God. So it's like, how did the universe begin? God. Why did this happen? Oh, it must be God. So we've got to be careful we're not doing that. We're going to look at the evidence objectively as best we can. But that's a bit hard, because as Dr. Frank Turek says, science doesn't say anything, scientists do. So what does he mean by that? Well, we've seen an example recently. This is a Time magazine article about how different advice by scientists about coronavirus was confusing the public. Because one scientist would say, you need to wear a face mask, and another scientist would say, you don't need to wear a face mask. Whenever we got to a stage of reopening, you'd have a scientist saying, yes, it's good to reopen. Another scientist would say, it's too early to reopen. Why were we getting the different answers when they've got the same data? The reason is because scientists, like all of us, come to the data with their own ideas. Every one of them, like us, is an individual. There's a Sherlock Holmes story where Holmes and Watson are invited by Scotland Yard to the scene of a grisly murder, and in the carriage on the way, Watson's thinking over the information they've been given by the inspector and thinking about the crime. He sees Holmes sat in the carriage, pipe in mouth, eyes closed, deep in thought, clearly distressed. Watson thinks, I'll help him out, and he says, what are you thinking here, Holmes? And Holmes is like, oh, I was just thinking about the concert we went to last night. It was amazing. Yeah, I absolutely loved it. And Watson's bemused. He says, Holmes, how can you be thinking about a concert when we're on the way to a murder? And Holmes is like, well, what else would I be thinking about? And Watson's like, well, coming to conclusions, trying to figure out how the crime was done. I mean, I'm no expert, but I've thought of at least 3 or 4 ways this crime could have been committed. And Holmes says, no. You've committed a fatal flaw. One should never come to conclusions before you have data, or else you'll make the facts fit your theory. Always base your theory on the facts. So what are the facts for God? They're the same as the facts which atheists use. We're both looking at the same facts. Some people say, well, this is clearly evidence for creation. Others say this is clearly evidence for evolution. So how do we look at this objectively? We're going to use what a cold case detective J. Warner Wallace calls inside or outside the room thinking. When a detective comes to a scene of a death, they need to determine, can they explain everything in the room by staying in the room? If they can, they're probably looking at a natural death. But if there's evidence in there which points to an intruder, then they've got a murder. So if they went into a scene of a body lying down, there's no visible signs of marks on the body. The man's got heart medicine in his cabinet. He's got a letter from the doctor saying, please call me urgently and we need to talk about your latest results about your heart. That all points to the man probably having a heart attack. However, if we found some DNA at the scene which didn't belong to the victim, if we found a gun at the scene which didn't belong to the victim, if we found fingerprints at the scene which weren't the victim, and we saw some muddy footprints leading out the open door, then we can conclude someone from outside has entered the room. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at certain bits of evidence which everyone needs to explain. We're only going to look at a few of these tonight. These are all aspects of the universe which, no matter who you are, you need to try and explain. We're going to look at a few of those and see, can we explain it by staying within the natural realm of the universe, or do we have to go outside the universe? And if we have to go outside, what's the best explanation? So, the first bit of evidence is the universe had a beginning in what we call now the Big Bang. So how do we know the universe had a beginning? It's what we call, there's an acronym, SURGE. So the S is the Second Law of Thermodynamics. That means that the usable energy in the universe is winding down, which means if you go into the past, there's more energy. That points to a beginning of the universe. Also, the universe is expanding. This is something which we've only discovered recently. There was a time when everyone thought that the universe was just static, but it is expanding at an increasing rate, which means if you go back in time, the universe was smaller, goes to a single point. That points to the beginning. Radiation from the Big Bang. We've found traces of radiation from the Big Bang. In fact, if any of you had an old radio, did you ever have it where you try and tune your radio in and you'd get a channel, but the channel's just static? That static is the radiation left over from the Big Bang. That's what your radio is picking up. It's a signal which is universal, literally. Then we have the great galaxies. This was something which was predicted if there was Big Bang, that we would have these great galaxy seeds, which would be areas in the universe where there would be matter, because when the universe was expanding, to begin with, when it first formed, you'd need these areas of matter so the universe wouldn't collapse in on itself or wouldn't expand so fast that stars wouldn't form. Now, this was only discovered in 1989, and Stephen Hawking said it was the most important discovery of the century, if not all time. George Smoot, who was one of the scientists who worked on it, said, if you're religious, it's like looking at God. And finally, we have the E, which is Einstein's theory of general relativity. That says that all space, time, and matter came into existence at the same point in time. They cannot exist without each other. So Alexander Vilenkin says, with proof now in place, cosmologists can no longer hide behind the possibility of an eternal universe. There is no escape. They have to face the problem of a cosmic beginning. Why do you think the universe having a beginning is a problem? And that's it. We face what is called the Cosmological argument, which sounds complicated. It's just 3 steps. Step 1, everything that begins to exist has a cause. Step 2, the universe began to exist. Step 3, therefore, the universe has a cause. But the question is, what could cause all time, space, and matter to come into existence from nothing? And if you're trying to get your head around what nothing is, because it is something which is very hard for us to imagine. I mean, you look inside an empty box, you'll say there's nothing in there. Well, that's not true. You've got particles, you've got space, you've got oxygen. Aristotle came up with a very good definition of nothing. He said nothing is what rocks dream about. So we are dealing with literally nothing. So there are only 2 types of causation: an agent causation or an event causation. So if you look at these dominoes, the dominoes over here are being knocked over by the domino before. That's what we call an event causation. But that very first domino is knocked over by an agent causation. Someone is physically knocking the first domino over. So with the universe, what is it? Is it an agent or is it an event? So we're going to come up with a suspect profile. So what attributes must the cause of the universe have if it created all space, time, and matter out of nothing? It cannot be made of space, time, or matter, because that is what the result is. So what would you say is something that is spaceless, timeless, immaterial? What type of thing are we dealing with here? If we look, whatever caused the universe to exist has to be external to the universe. It has to be timeless because it created time. Spaceless because it created space. It has to be immaterial. It has to be uncaused because we are looking for what the Greeks called the unmoved mover, the uncaused first cause. The Greeks agreed the universe must have something which is uncaused, which is the first cause of everything, has to be powerful because it's created out of nothing. Now, if you were to say to someone those attributes, what would they say you're describing? It kind of fits a description of God. Hugh Ross says, proof of the beginning of time probably ranks as the most theologically significant theorem. This great significance arises from the theorem establishing that the universe must be caused by some entity capable of creating the universe entirely independent of space and time. Such an entity matches the attributes of the God of the Bible, but is contradicted by the gods of Eastern and indeed all other religions who create within space and time. See, the God of the Bible is unique in that way. If you talk about the gods like Zeus or the Norse gods like Thor or Odin, they exist after the creation of the universe. We know who their parents are. Whereas the God of the Bible is the God who creates everything. So, are there other ways of explaining this? There are a few. Some people have said, well, maybe the universe actually is eternal. Well, the evidence doesn't show that. Or other people have said, well, what if the universe expands, gets to a certain point, then collapses in upon itself, and then expands, and then collapses in upon itself in an eternal cycle of birth and rebirth? However, again, the evidence doesn't show that. Gravity is not strong enough to bring the universe back in, and the universe is expanding at an increasing rate. If this was true, we'd expect the universe to expand at an ever slowing rate, so it would then collapse upon itself. Another theory is the multiverse theory, that we are just one of many different universes. The problem with this theory, there's a few. Firstly, there is absolutely no evidence for it. And two, if the multiverse theory is correct, if we're thinking about staying in the room, staying out the room, you have to go out the room. You cannot stay within the room of the natural universe to explain how the universe came into being. So again, we've got the two types of causation. Agent causation, either something created everything from nothing, or an event causation, which says nothing created everything out of nothing, which means we're left with God or nothing as an explanation for why the universe is here. Dr. Robert Justrow said, astronomers now find they have painted themselves into a corner because they have proven by their own methods that the world began abruptly in an act of creation, to which you can trace the seeds of every star, every planet, every living thing in the cosmos and on Earth, and they have found that this all happened as a product of forces they cannot hope to discover. That there are what I or anyone would call supernatural forces at work is now, I think, a scientifically proven fact. But there's an objection. Oh yeah, well, who created God? You often hear that. It's like, well, God created the universe. Oh yeah, well, who created God? What are the attributes of God we had? He's timeless. He's uncaused. He's eternal. That's what the evidence is showing. So, what caused the uncaused? The column cosmological argument says everything that began as a cause. Well, if God's eternal, did God begin to exist? Or has he always existed? Always existed. So, if he's always existed, does he have a cause? No. So it's an argument which, when you think about it, doesn't make a lot of sense. But again, we have people like Lawrence Krauss who, what they've tried to do is redefine nothing. So the universe comes out of nothing. So he says, physics has changed what we mean by nothing. Empty space is a boiling, bubbling brew of virtual particles popping in and out of existence. If you wait long enough, that kind of nothing will always produce particles from which you can get a universe. Now, as we said, because of Einstein's theory of general relativity, all time, space, and matter come into existence at the same time, so you cannot use time, space, and matter. So let's look at his statement again. Physics has changed what we mean by nothing. Empty space is a boiling, bubbling brew of virtual particles popping in and out of existence. If you wait long enough, that kind of nothing will always produce particles. So what he's saying is, if you have space, matter, and time, then you'll be able to get space, matter, and time. Well, yeah. But again, this isn't where the evidence is pointing. Hugh Ross says, appeals to imagined forces and phenomenon which have been the basis for all the cosmological models proposed to avoid the Big Bang implications about God, the disproof of these models, and the ongoing appeal by non-theists to more and more bizarre unknowns and unknowables seems to reflect the growing strength of the case of theism. He's saying, look, the fact they're going to such extremes and such ridiculous ideas just to avoid the implications is strong evidence for God. But the late Professor Stephen Hawking said, because there is a law such as gravity, the universe can and will create itself from nothing. Fellow Oxford Professor John Lennox responded to this comment and said, what this all goes to show is that nonsense remains nonsense even by a world-famous scientist. Because there's a law like gravity. Well, what's gravity? Gravity just explains what happens when you've got two objects. It's the attraction. Where does gravity come from? It just pushes the question back. Stephen Hawking himself admitted if the Big Bang theory is correct, then his idea of gravity doesn't work. But he says if you redefine what nothing is, then you can get a universe. So you have to redefine the terms. So again, we're still left with the same emerging suspect profile, something which is external to the universe, timeless, spaceless, immaterial, uncaused, powerful enough to create the universe. Is this the God of the Bible? We don't know yet. But it fits the attributes. It fits the attributes which have always been assigned to him. Second bit of evidence, the universe appears to be fine-tuned. Imagine you went into a cockpit and every single dial was pointed to navigate you to France. You looked at the fuel gauge, you had just enough fuel to get you to France. You looked at the luggage, and all the luggage said, going to France. Would you conclude that that plane is going to France because someone has planned it to go to France, or someone left the window open and all the dials blew randomly to France? See, the same way, the universe, scientists have discovered, and this is only in the last 50 or so years, the laws that govern the universe are finely tuned. And they're finely tuned for what it appears is one single purpose: life. The universe appears to be designed for life. So how do we know this? For example, the strength of gravity. If you imagine a ruler, which is the length of the universe, which is 15 billion light years across, and this ruler is divided into 1-inch increments, you've got to pick the strength of gravity on that ruler. The problem is, if you're 1 inch off, life does not exist. If you're 1 inch one way, gravity is so powerful, when the universe first formed, it crushes in on itself. Too light by 1 inch, it expands so quickly, no planets form. You've got the cosmological constant, which is the energy density of space. This is fine-tuned to 1 part in 100 million billion 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 billion. To give you an example of an illustration, that's the same odds as throwing a dart from the moon and hitting a predetermined atom on Earth. That's how unlikely this is. If you add just those two together, the strength of gravity, cosmological constant, that's 1 part in 100 million trillion 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 trillion. Or it's equal to 1 atom in the entire universe. Just 2. There's over 50 of these laws, and they are all that finely tuned. Again, Hugh Ross says, with considerable security, therefore, we can draw the conclusion that even with 100 billion trillion stars in the observable universe, the probability of finding, without divine intervention, a single planet capable of supporting physical life is much less than 1 in a trillion 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 trillion. The odds are actually higher that the reader will be killed by a sudden reversal in the second law of thermodynamics. That's how crazy these laws are. I mean, Dr. Vera Kurowski, who won the Nobel Prize, says, the exquisite order displayed by our scientific understanding of the physical world calls for the divine. Scientists are looking at this and saying, it looks like there's a purpose behind this. It looks like there's a mind. Now, this fine-tuning, it's foundational. It's the strength of gravity. It's the weak and strong forces of the nucleus. It's stuff like, the atoms and stuff. It's also regional. The universe, our universe is just the right size. It's just the right shape. It moves at just the right speed. And we're in just the right position in that universe for life to exist. It's also locationally fine-tuned. Our planet has just the right conditions. We're just the right distance from the sun. The fact we've got the moon, the fact we've got all the water and the elements we have on the world. It doesn't have to be that way, but it is. We have this fine-tuning on multiple layers. And again, what is it pointing to? Life. But not just any life, because you could have it that, only bacteria existed. It's pointing towards being here for intelligent life. In other words, it looks like the universe is designed with a purpose, and that purpose is you. Hugh Ross says, rather than seeing ourselves as insignificant specks of immensity out of the cosmos, we can consider the immensity an indicator of our worth. It seems the Creator invested a great deal, a universe of 50 billion trillion stars, plus 100 times more matter, all fine-tuned to mind-boggling precision for us. So, well, again, are there other explanations for this? Yes. Again, multiverse generator. What if there's a multiverse generator? Maybe these laws are fine-tuned like this because random universes pop into existence and everyone's slightly different. And what? We won the national lottery or the cosmic lottery. We just happen to be in the one which matches, so that's fine. That doesn't really work. It doesn't explain anything. Plus, again, you can't prove it. There's no evidence for it. To believe in the multiverse requires faith. And blind faith at that, because you can't prove it. Other ones are, well, maybe it's physical necessity. Maybe the universe has to be designed this way. It doesn't appear so. The universe, as we've shown, with the strength of gravity, 15 billion light years an inch, it could have been set anywhere there. It didn't have to be this way. Well, maybe it's just chance. Maybe we just got lucky. To be that lucky? Really? Or maybe it's this way because we can observe it. Someone said it's like if you went to someone and said, oh, I went before a firing squad this morning. What? Yeah, I went before a firing squad. How did you survive? Well, I'm here, so I just did. Would you take that as a reasonable explanation for how they survived, or would you maybe ask one or two more questions of that? So again, these explanations, they don't match what the evidence is showing, or they completely ignore it. But there is an explanation which does make sense. But again, the problem is you have to step outside the universe. That these things appear to be designed because maybe they are. Orenzo Pananz said, astronomy leads to the unique event, a universe which was created out of nothing, one with a very delicate balance needed to provide exactly right conditions to permit life, and one which has an underlying, one might say, supernatural plan. This, again, the fine-tuning argument was an argument which convinced one very famous scientist, you might have heard of him, Charles Darwin. He says, reason tells me of the extreme difficulty, or rather impossibility, of conceiving this immense and wonderful universe, including man, with his capacity of looking far backwards and far into futurity, as the result of blind chance or necessity. When thus reflecting, I feel compelled to look at the first cause having an intelligent mind in some degree analogous with that of man, and I deserve to be called a theist. As the Psalms say, the heavens declare the glory of God, and the sky above proclaims his handiwork. Day to day pours out speech, and night by night reveals knowledge. You look at the universe, and you look at how fine-tuned it is and what it points to, the fact of where it appears to have come from, and the purpose of which. Because again, we're now seeing two very different views. We're seeing one view of it's chance, it's blind luck, everything's meaningless, it is just because of it is a roll of the dice. Or the other hand is, it's designed for a purpose, and you are important. You are part of this. This has been designed so that you can exist. So what other evidence do we have? Life originating from non-life. Again, this is agreed on by everyone. So, how did life begin? If you ask Richard Dawkins, he doesn't know. And he says nobody knows. He says that they're still waiting for the big moment, as he calls it, but he knows it must be what kind of event it must be. Someone asked him, is there a way that it could have been designed? And he says, yes. And they said, well, explain how. And he said, it could be that some alien came to Earth, an alien which came about by Darwinian evolution, and tampered with life on Earth, and that's how we get life on Earth. So Darwinian evolution began because an alien interceded. And that alien came about by Darwinian evolution. But Darwinian evolution needs someone to come in and interfere. So doesn't evolution disprove God? Again, you hear this. Well, evolution disproves God. I could spend an entire evening on evolution. I won't. What I will say is, evolution describes what happens when you have life. Evolution doesn't tell you how you get life. Evolution just says about when you have life, then you'll have like variations. It has not and has never explained how life comes about. In fact, William Lane Craig says, so any doubts I would have about the theory of biological evolution would be not biblical, but rather scientific. Namely, what it imagines is fantastically improbable. Burrow and Tipler, two physicists in their book, The Anthropic Cosmological Principle, listed 10 steps in the course of human evolution, each of which is so improbable that before it would occur, the sun would have ceased to be a main sequence star and incinerated the Earth. And they calculated the probability of the evolution of the human genome by somewhere between 4 to the negative 180th power to the 110,000th power, and 4 to the negative 360th power to the 110,000th power. So if evolution did occur on this planet, it was literally a miracle and therefore evidence for the existence of God. So where did life originate? Depends who you ask. Some people say it began in the water. Some people say, oh, well, it began in outer space and maybe like a meteorite brought it to Earth. Some say it began underground. Some said it begins in the ground. Some say in the atmosphere. Every single one of those scientists disagrees with the others because none of them work. There's problems with all of them. So we're nowhere closer to finding out where life began. Because what you need for life is what they call simple proteins. Now, proteins are amino acids which are coiled and fashioned in distinctive and useful shapes. So this is a protein shape. So I'm just going to have to exit just for a second so I can show you a video, which I think is useful just to get an idea of how amazing this is. So just give me a second because I'm just going to have to do a bit of tinkering. That's not the right tinkering.
Here is a cell, the basic unit of all living most human cells, there is a structure called the nucleus. The nucleus contains the genome. In humans, the genome is split between 23 pairs of chromosomes. Each chromosome contains a long strand of DNA, tightly packaged around proteins called histones. Within the DNA are sections called genes. These genes contain the instructions for making proteins. When the gene is switched on, an enzyme called RNA polymerase attaches to the start of the gene. It moves along the DNA, making a strand of messenger RNA out of free bases in the nucleus. The DNA code determines the order in which the free bases are added to the messenger RNA. This process is called transcription. Before the messenger RNA can be used as a template for the production of proteins, it needs to be processed. This involves removing and adding sections of RNA. The messenger RNA then moves out of the nucleus into the cytoplasm. Protein factories in the cytoplasm, called ribosomes, bind to the messenger RNA. The ribosome reads the code in the messenger RNA to produce a chain made up of amino acids. There are 20 different types of amino acids. Transfer RNA molecules carry the amino acids to the ribosome. The messenger RNA is read 3 bases at a time. At each trip that is read, a transfer RNA delivers the corresponding amino acids. This is added to a growing chain of amino acids. Once the last amino acid has been added, the chain folds into a complex 3D shape to form the protein.
So that's just how DNA works. That's happening in your body right now. Those little biomechanical machines are just working away, getting DNA around. You know, it's quite amazing. But it does create the origin of life catch-22. We've got a bit of a chicken and an egg problem here. See, proteins are required to create those ribosome machines, but those machines are created out of proteins. So which came first? The proteins to create the machines, or the machines which create the proteins, which are made of proteins? Another problem is DNA contains information. If you were to see that on the beach, I know what you'd think. Well, the waves did that. Whenever we see information, we always conclude a mind must be behind it. In fact, scientists have built telescopes like this all around the world, which are pointing into space looking for a single message from outer space, because if they find a single message out there, that's proof we're not alone in the universe. Turns out they might have been looking in the wrong direction. If they're looking for information, they might have wanted to point inwards. Dr. Stephen C. Meyer says there isn't a single example in the history of the universe in which information came from anything other than an intelligent source. So, what kind of information are we dealing with? Imagine you had a dog and you put the dog at the typewriter and the dog types out some messages. There's different levels of intelligence. Level 1, let's say the dog typed out 4LG24, 4LG24, 4LG24. You'd be impressed. You'd give the dog a treat, definitely. Now that's level 1 of information. It's called statistics. Now, it doesn't mean anything, but it is information. A mind was behind this information. Now, can nature create these kind of patterns, say? Yes. For example, if you look at snowflakes, you definitely see patterns there, or waves might create patterns. You've got the next level, which is cosmologics. So the dog might have written, grand the eats letting. Now, you don't know what the dog's actually saying, but there's something there. The next one is semantics. Grandpa is eating. That's definite information. That's information which is describing something. And very often you can see in badly worded signs somewhere between these two levels. Then you get to pragmatics. Let's eat, Grandpa. Now that's a level up because that is expecting a response. See, that one is just describing something. But level 4 expects a reply. And then you get to apopetics, which call me when it's lunch. That's an instruction. Again, that's the highest level. Also a sign that you've got to the highest level is, if you change the slightest thing, the message gets altered. So for example, let's eat, Grandpa. If you change it ever so slightly, we get let's eat, Grandpa. The same with DNA. We've got the code at the bottom. If you change just a few characteristics, you get the difference between the dog having pointy ears or floppy ears, short legs, long legs. It's only a few slight changes in this code. And as we saw from the video, the information expects a response. The DNA has this information with the understanding that the proteins are going to be made to fit that purpose. 1 teaspoon of DNA has the capacity to store all the information to build all the proteins for all the 1,000 million species of organisms that have ever existed. And also have enough space left over to include all the information from every book ever published. 1 teaspoon of DNA. Bill Gates says, DNA is like a computer program, but far, far more advanced than any software ever created. See, us humans with our, fantastic minds and all our ingenuity, trying to create something, have not got anywhere near what came about by chance. We were intentionally trying to do something, and yet we fall so far short. Another illustration, I think, which shows how beautiful DNA is you may have seen this. This is a window from York Minster. Very intricate, very beautiful. That's a cross-section of DNA. So the last bit of evidence we're going to look at tonight. Biological organisms appear to be designed. Now, this might sound like a controversial statement, but Richard Dawkins himself says that biology is the study of complicated things that give the appearance of having been designed for a purpose. Richard Dawkins admits, you look at nature, it appears to be designed. He says, as a biologist, his job is to explain how it wasn't. So, what do we mean by it appears to be designed? Let's say you were at a crime scene again, and you found a garrote, just 2 bits of wood with a bit of metal in between. How do you know that's designed? You have these different things here. So decision, choice, reflective. It's irreducibly complex. You can't explain it naturally. It appears to be goal-driven. It's information-dependent, sophisticated. It has echoes of familiarity, and dubious that it could occur just by chance. Now, you don't need all of those to prove that it's been designed. For example, a bird's nest doesn't have all of those steps, but because it has a few steps, you can see it has been designed. Which takes us to another thing which is inside your bodies, the flagellum, and the flagellum motor. So what's a flagellum? It's little bacteria. And very back there, it's got a little tail. So again, I'm going to show you a video just showing what the flagellum does. So again, sorry, just bear with me. That's not the right video. Is it? No. Just give me 1 moment. Okay. Looks like I'm just going to have to miss that video. That's okay, I can describe it. Right, so the flagellum, the little tail at the end of the bacteria, here's a diagram of what it looks like in 3 dimensions and a cross section. It has a motor which is designed of about 40 different parts, each integrated together to make the tail move. Now this tail, it can turn about at a quarter turn, completely 180 degrees in liquid. The speed at which it goes at is, if it was human size, would be like 120 miles an hour. If you look at it, and you look at a motor which has been designed by humans, again, it looks rather similar. They're serving a similar function. And so again, if you look at those different attributes to see if something's been designed, the bacterial flagellum meets those criteria. It is irreversibly complex. You can't take anything away from it. It doesn't work. It's built with a purpose in mind. It's goal-directed. It's got every single of one of those attributes we said, which shows that something's designed. So how do you explain this? Well, one explanation is scientists have discovered what they call T3SS, which is the diagram on the left there. That is another biological machine. It looks very similar to the flagellum. So some evolutionary scientists have concluded that maybe the flagellum evolved from this simpler organism. There's a few problems with that. Firstly, T3SS appears to be designed. It's also irreversibly complex. You cannot take a single part away from that. It doesn't work. It has to come whole. And it's so irreversibly complex that other evolutionary scientists believe that T3SS is actually de-evolved from the flagellum. So some scientists say the flagellum is evolved from T3SS, whereas the other scientists are saying, no, T3SS is de-evolved from the flagellum. So how can you have the flagellum come from that when that comes from that? They can't explain it. So how do we explain this apparent design? If we go by the inside the room, outside the room, maybe it's borrowed. Again, we've shown it doesn't appear to be, because you cannot have steps in between. It has to come manufactured as it is. Maybe it evolved. Well, again, no, because chicken and the egg problem. How do you get this? You don't have any steps in between. There's an explanation outside the room. It appears to be designed because it is designed. So if we look at our emerging profile of the suspect here, we can add some things here. So the suspect must be external to the universe, non-spatial, atemporal, non-material, uncaused, powerful enough to create everything we see in the universe, specifically purposeful enough to produce a universe fine-tuned for life, intelligent and communicative, creative and resourceful. Again, this is just where the evidence is pointing. This isn't, well, the Bible says it's God, let's get all the evidence to fit. This is what the evidence is showing. That if we've got a cause to the universe, a cause which has to fit these different criteria. And again, if you went to someone on the street and you said, what am I describing? What would they say? As it says in Psalms, for it was you who created my inward parts. You knitted together in my mother's me together in my mother's womb. I praise you because I've been fearfully and wonderfully made. Again, when we see those little biological machines, we see the information in DNA. How true that is. How incredible it is that we have life as we are. I mean, so what do we do with this information? There was a very famous atheist in 20th century called Antony Flew. Antony Flew was the Richard Dawkins of his time, he was, except more so. He wrote books like this, The Presumptions of Atheism. He spent 50 years debating Christians. Here's like a screenshot from one of his debates. As you can see, there he is on the left, arguing God does not exist. This was session 2, they did about 12 sessions of these. He famously debated C.S. Lewis. But then, he wrote this book, There is a God, How the World's Most Notorious Atheist Changed His Mind. So why did he change his mind? To quote him himself, he says, I now believe that the universe was brought into existence by an infinite intelligence. I believe that this universe's intricate laws manifest what scientists have called the mind of God. I believe that life and reproduction originates in a divine source. Why do I believe this? Given that I expounded and defended atheism for more than half a century, the short answer is this. This is the world picture as I see it that has emerged from modern science. This isn't someone who wanted it to be true. This isn't a case of someone reading the Bible and then trying to fill the gaps of their knowledge. This is someone who the evidence led them to this conclusion. At the beginning we saw this quote, science and faith are fundamentally incompatible. Science helps religion only by disproving its claims. However, I think we've seen tonight that what Dr. James Torr says is true. I stand in awe of God because of what he has done for his creation. Only a rookie who knows nothing about science would say science takes away from faith. If you really study science, it will bring you closer to God. So, any questions? Or thoughts or anything? Yes. Yes. Yeah. So if you take the size of the ruler as 15 billion light years, which was the then known size of the universe, like you say, the universe is expanding at an ever-increasing rate, which again shows the universe had a beginning, because if you work backwards, it goes back to a single point. But again, that's just one of over 50 different laws. I mean, when Charles Darwin was alive, the one law they found was like, 1 part in 1,000. But now it's just the scientific method and like how they've measured it, it's just become more and more incredible. The odds of this just happening by chance. Like I say, you take two laws, it's like finding a predetermined atom in the entire universe. And that's just 2 of these 50. It gets to the point of it's scientifically improbable, like not improbable, impossible, that it's just happened by chance. I mean, it's like if I stood here and we were playing poker, and it's like, royal flush. Dealt again, royal flush. Played again, royal flush. How many times would I do it before you thought, wait, there's something tricky going on here? Or by the time I'd done it like 150 times, would you say, he's the luckiest man I've ever met? It gets to a point beyond numerical chance. And like I say, when you take into account all the other evidence, like I say, we've not gone through all the evidence yet. Out of those bits of evidence which I showed at the beginning, we've only covered 4. We're going to cover the rest of them next week, which is more to do with like mind and morality, like that. But this is the physical world stuff, and the stuff I've shown you isn't everything. This is just the tip of the iceberg. This is just, okay, what can I fit in this evening? So when you're thinking, what's the evidence? That's not it. That's a part of it. But it introduces you to the fact of there is evidence. That a lot of scientists now are looking at the evidence and they are asking questions. Because scientists for a long time have asked certain questions, the why, the when, the where, the how, the what. They've avoided a question. Who? And a lot of scientists now, based on this evidence, are starting to ask that question. And again, it's the evidence is pointing to something which sounds very, very, very similar to the God of the Bible. Does this evidence mean that Christianity is true? Have we proved this is the God of the Bible? Not yet. By the time we get to week 6, we will have. But not overshooting it yet. But this does match the description of the God of the Bible. It doesn't match the description of the God of all the other ancient religions. See, before Jesus was born, Judaism was the only one saying this. You didn't have all the other ancient myths talking about gods who created the universe out of nothing, who were external to the universe. They all talked about the universe being created and then the gods were born from that. The Judeo-Christian God is unique, but matches the evidence. Any other thoughts or questions? Yeah, that is a good question. I think if I was having a conversation with someone and they said, I don't know if there's any evidence for God, would I sit them down and show them the slideshow? Probably not. But the same way I would talk to anyone, ask them questions, see what their understanding is. But what I hope this evening has done is shown you that atheism doesn't hold all the cards when it comes to science. A lot of what modern atheists talk about in terms of scientific proof is based on Victorian ideas which haven't changed since that time. Theories like evolution, where Charles Darwin, he didn't have the information about DNA. He didn't know how complex it was. Charles Darwin thought that You had very simple organisms. However, science has shown there's no such thing as a simple organism. And there was a Victorian idea that life came into existence out of nothing all the time. If you had a sandwich which you threw in the bin, and then a few days later there was a load of flies in that bin, there was a Victorian idea that, well, what's happened is all the particles and molecules in that sandwich have evolved into flies. It's just that simple. It's easy to get life from nothing, and it's like, it's incredibly complex. It just doesn't, it's now got to the point as well where the chances of it happening by chance and random mutation it's a hard pill to swallow. We had, a few years ago, a lot of biological scientists wrote an open letter saying we question Charles Darwin's theories on evolution. What the question was, because there's actually 6 types of evolution. A lot of people don't know this, but there's actually 6. 5 of them haven't been observed. What they call microevolution has been observed. That's change within a kind. So, for example, you have a wide variety of dogs. They all came from a dog. Now, Charles Darwin's idea is that what happens is you have random mutation which adds complexity. However, what scientists have discovered is if you have a Chihuahua and you have a St. Bernard, a Chihuahua cannot give birth to a child the size of a St. Bernard. And a St. Bernard can't give birth to a child the size of a Chihuahua. But their common ancestor had the genetic material so it could have given birth to a child either size. Basically, what's happened is, over time, information's been lost. The more animal seems to have evolved, the less information is available in the DNA. So the common ancestor to the dog had the ability to produce a wide variety of offspring with this different genetic material, but the mutated children have lost genetic material. They haven't gained anything. And it's the same across all species. The more evolved an animal appears to be, the less information it's got in its cell, which goes against what Charles Darwin thought. He thought mutation gains complexity. However, again, the science doesn't show that. He also thought that, he said there was a major flaw in his theory. He said that we would discover hundreds, if not thousands, of in-between animals, because all the animals are related. We've not discovered one. You sometimes hear on the news, oh, we found a missing link, and then they look into it and it's like, actually, no, it's not. Biologists have also discovered that instead of a tree of life, it's a meadow of life. The animals are all completely distinct. They're not linked together on any biological level. Again, it's information which Darwin didn't have, and it's information which, the implications of which, some people don't want to look at. But again, it's something which we don't have to worry about. But yeah, again, the tide more and more, scientifically, the evidence is pointing in one direction. And for us, it's a very encouraging direction. And that's what I really hope. I hope that just this short glimpse of information has given you encouragement. Yeah, there's a few books. Professor John Lennox, he's excellent when it comes to science. There's the book by Frank Turek, I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist, which that goes through a lot of the information. A lot of the information we've used tonight has come from a book by cold case homicide detective Gay Warner Wallace. He's got 2 books, God's Crime Scene and Cold Case Christianity, where he looks at the evidence from the point of view of a cold case detective. But there's also a book by Greg Copel called Tactics, and that's a very good book for giving you a way of starting those conversations. He uses what he calls the Colombo Tactic. So if you remember Colombo, he'd always ask questions. As the actor Peter Falk said, dealing with Colombo was like being pecked to death by a duck. So he says if someone makes a claim about Christianity or about the universe, you don't have to automatically defend your worldview. If they've made a claim, they've got to support their worldview. So he's got 3 questions. Question 1, what do you mean by that? And just let them explain. Just see where they're coming from. Question 2, how did you come to that conclusion? And then question 3 is, have you considered? At which point you can come into it. But again, it talks about different types of people you might meet, because there are some people who are very open. If you start talking about the evidence, some people will be like, wow, really? Can I hear more? There are some people, they'll say, okay, well, what about this? And as soon as you start answering, oh yeah, well, what about this? And when you start answering that, well, what about this? They don't really want to hear. Yeah. 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 Greg Copel, he says his ideal conversation with someone would be, he would spend, if he had an hour with them, he would spend 55 minutes listening to them and then spend 5 minutes just at the end talking. So listen to what they've got to say, listen to how them describe their life, and then put their life through the lens of the gospel. Or in this case, again, we saw the 2 different worldviews. It's all chance. It's all meaningless. Who cares? Whatever. You know, you're here today, you're gone tomorrow. Or the universe was created, and it was created by an external being who created it for a purpose, and that purpose appears to be life. So that means you do have a purpose. Life ultimately does have meaning. Whereas the atheist worldview, it's meaningless, it's chance. But the evidence increasingly shows that's not the case. That there is purpose, and you can get to know it. There is a creator, and as we'll find out over the next few weeks, it's not a creator. The evidence again shows that this creator isn't a creator who wound up a little toy, which is the universe, and then let it go. We're going to see over the next few weeks, as we talk next week about the problem of evil, and the week after about the archaeological evidence for the Old Testament, and then the evidence for Jesus in the New Testament, and the evidence for the resurrection. This is not a God who has let the universe and us go on our own. He's still acting in the universe. He's still acting in history. It's the entity which created every single atom in the universe is an entity which he says you can know. And again, that's something which is as mind-blowing to me as the strength of gravity. It's something which just seems so incomprehensible, but again, as we'll go through the next few weeks, we're going to see where does the evidence point. And again, I think the fact that I used to be an atheist and I've given this talk and I'm going to give 6 more, it has definitely persuaded me. And I think it is something which is persuasive. We live in a culture where science has almost become the religion. There's some people who, when presented with this evidence, it's like, well, yeah, okay, but if you give science enough time, it will explain this. We spoke about the God of the gaps theory. Well, isn't that a science of the gaps theory? You know, if you was at a trial and you had to make a decision based on the evidence, you couldn't say, well, actually, can we wait 10 years and then come back? No, you've got to make a decision based on the current data. And if the data changes, then your ideas have got to change. That's true in everything. But we all make judgments based on the evidence. Every time you go and step in your car, you make a judgment that it's not going to blow up on you before you step in it. That's a judgment you make. We make judgments which affect our lives every day. And as C.S. Lewis said, this is the biggest question. It's either not important or it's unbelievably important. I mean, the fact that some people think the universe came to existence from nothing, it's like William Lane Craig said, those same people don't think that a hippopotamus is going to spontaneously appear in their living room. I mean, they think an entire universe can come out of nothing, but why doesn't something pop out of nothing all the time? But I've got a question for you, because we've spoken a lot about this, like the universe as a crime scene. And we've looked at the evidence and, like, you know, a detective, where does it point to? But there's one thing which detectives try and do, which I want you to think about, because we've not spoke about it yet. Motive. If the universe has been created, and it's been created by a being with a mind, a being which didn't have to create, because this being is external to space, time, and matter, it didn't have any external forces acting upon it. Why did it create? Why did it create a universe with life? Again, as we go through the next few weeks, I hope to address that more. Hope we can come to some kind of conclusion, but again, the question itself raises, like, amazing sparks in the imagination. But imagine you had a crime scene and all the evidence pointed to one person, and you thought to yourself, that's it, we've got them, this is it, they've got the motive, they had the means. You know, the person who was robbed, they hated. They said they were going to make this person pay. It was like a former boss who fired them. The boss has now been robbed. We found, like, footprints which match the footprints of the suspect. We saw a car similar to his car leaving. We've got him. All the evidence points to this one person. But then you find out the person wasn't there. It turns out he was in prison because he'd got arrested for something else. No matter what the other evidence shows, he can't be a person. The next week, what we're going to be looking at is what most people will say is the piece of evidence which means they can't believe in God. And that is the fact that we live in a world where there is evil and suffering, and yet the Bible claims that we have a loving God, an all-powerful God. So next week, we're going to be looking at, does evil and suffering point away from God? Does it mean that the God of the Bible, you know, can't be him? Or is it possible that evil and suffering actually points towards God? And that's what we're going to be looking at next week. So, thank you very much for coming. Hope you've enjoyed it. If you want to talk afterwards, please feel free. The fact I've signed up to do 6 weeks of this, I hope shows I'm more than happy enough to talk about this. And yeah, thanks again, and if you can make it, hope to see you next week. Thanks very much.